Okay, quick story by way of introduction. It's a story about a Chabad young chassid who was on the street in Manhattan, and he stopped a young man walking by and he said, "Are you Jewish?" He said, "Yes, I am. Why do you ask?" He said, "I wonder if you put on tefillin today." He said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I did." "Why do you ask?" He said, "Well, we want people to perform the mitzvah." So the fellow said, "Well, you see that woman across the street, I happen to know her, I know she's Jewish, why don't you ask her?" So he said, "Well, it's really not a mitzvah for women." But so the fellow said, "Well, isn't it, don't we learn that in the Bible that King Saul's daughter, Michal, wore tefillin?" And the fellow said, "That's true, but times have changed." So times have changed a little bit. Our discussion this evening is with Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, who is a real treasure of the American Jewish community. And we're going to talk about Joseph's new book entitled Rebbe, The Life and Teachings of Menachem M. Schneerson, the Most Influential Rabbi in Modern History. And just by way of beginning, I want to encourage those of you who haven't read the book to do so. It's a very thorough and thoughtful book, and a look at the Rebbe's life and lasting impact, not only on the Chabad movement, but on the Jewish community and really the rest of the world as well. So there's a lot to talk about the life of one of the most fascinating people in Jewish history. How would you describe this book? Is it a biography?
The book is a biography, but it is primarily a biography of the Rebbe's years of leadership. In other words, there are two definite. The Rebbe lived quite a long life, and the first half of his life was growing up under a communist regime in the former Soviet Union. Then his years in Germany, and he was studying in Germany during the very years of the Nazis starting to come to power, and then in France. But I primarily focus on his years as the leader of the movement, which starts in 1951. At the back of the book, I have like a 60-page biography, and it's done in a way thematically. It's not done event by event. It's done by his approach on a large variety of issues, but I was able to integrate a lot of personal material. One of the things that made it a little hard to write a conventional biography of the Rebbe was that he was a very unself-revealing person. He did not characteristically speak about himself in speeches. He was not a big teller of anecdotes. So very much of the material that one has about him was the result of other people's interactions with him, and that's how I could reach conclusions about how he met with people, how he guided people. But he was not the sort of person who kept diaries that would have, first of all, that would have been accessible, but that would have been filled with that would have filled in a lot of the information that we cannot possibly know.
How did you come to write this story?
I had grown up in a household in which the Rebbe was always an object of discussion and interest. My father, Shlomo Telushkin alav hashalom, was for more than 40 years the accountant for the Rebbe, and he had also been the accountant for the Rebbe's father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, from the time Chabad came to America, because my grandfather, Nissen Telushkin alav hashalom, had a very close connection with Chabad. He was an anomaly. He was part of Chabad, but he was also part of Mizrahi. He was an ardent Zionist. So I knew things. I had always had an interest in the Rebbe. But what was really most striking to me was that in the aftermath of the Rebbe's death, the continued expansion of Chabad fascinated me. Because when the Rebbe suffered his stroke in 1992, and for the next 2 years, he was very, very sick and very limited, it was widely assumed that the movement had reached its peak and was probably going to start to decline. And then in the aftermath of his death, the movement's experienced an extraordinary growth. So it became apparent we're dealing with a very unusual leader. The whole Jewish community, as the editor of the Jewish Week, is quite obsessed with the issue of Jewish viability, the fears about Jewish decline.
Right.
So here's a man who, even after his death, continues in a way to lead or to inspire leadership. And I thought, this is somebody whose life is really worth looking into. It's always more interesting to look into a success story and see what it might yield for us.
So were you concerned about the scrutiny that was going to be brought to this work in terms of either from the Chabad community or from others in terms of criticism, or how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I found that the Chabad community was very, very open. They really opened many doors to me. I believe part of it was there was an innate trust that I had goodwill, because very fortunately both my father and grandfather had left behind enormous goodwill, and they knew I had no interest in entering into this to do some sort of expose. Even if I had, it turns out there was not really all that much to expose. There wasn't, there was nothing of that sort. But so they were very open, and I think what they were also open to was to the idea of a biography being written about the Rebbe by someone who was not intrinsically part of Chabad. I think there was sort of an innate recognition that within Chabad, the writings often, because of the extraordinary reverence in which the Rebbe was held, the writings would often acquire a sort of hagiographic sensibility that would not make it that compellingly readable to people outside of the world of Chabad. So that really was my agenda. I wanted to help present the Rebbe to the world.
But you had final say on what goes in the book?
Well, not only did I have final say, that was a precondition that they had no editorial control. And as I always said, number one, as a writer, I needed to safeguard my own integrity. But secondly, I said the book would have no credibility if I could not say that. And so, yes, that was always understood.
Right. Now, on the first page, in effect, you note that you had profound disagreements with the Rebbe on a couple of issues. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I had grown up in my teen years and in my 20s. I was very active in the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. I'm speaking at one of the real headquarters of it, because this is, of course, where Shlomo Riskin served at one time as the president, and so we know how active it was. And the Rebbe was very much opposed to public demonstrations. In fact, I know that when my friend Dennis Prager and I wrote our first book, then called 8 Questions People Ask About Judaism, my father did give a copy of it to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe expressed to my father, he was positive, but he expressed his demurral about our support for public demonstrations for Russian Jews. So that was one where I had a different attitude. I came to understand the Rebbe's position as being more nuanced than I had thought.
Right, just to be clear, I mean, apparently Chabad had for many years been active quietly in the Soviet Union.
Extremely active. Yeah. No, it's hard to identify. The Rebbe's concern for the Jews of Russia was never a question, and from whatever's been revealed, he was unbelievable. He did so much, but it was, so the only dispute was a tactical dispute. He thought that demonstrations would cause the Russians to act worse. We thought that demonstrations would force the hands of the Russians. I have the feeling, of what you always hear, that they talk about the good cop, bad cop routine. I have the feeling it was good that both sides really became involved. Right. And so that was one, and the Rebbe also opposed all territorial concessions by Israel, including an ardent opposition to Camp David and to the peace agreement that Israel reached with Egypt, which the Rebbe was convinced would in the long run end up causing more Jewish lives to be lost. By the way, it's important to note he did not root his argument in Kedushat Haaretz. He did not root his opposition to territorial compromise in the idea that this is Jewish land that can't be returned. He believed that it was an inyan, and it was a matter of pikuach nefesh, of endangerment of life. And I thought the reverse, because I thought prior to the peace agreement that was reached at Camp David, Israel had had 5 wars with Egypt: 48, Suez in 56, 67, the War of Attrition, and the Yom Kippur War, in which thousands of soldiers were killed. And since then, it's been better. So, but what I tried to do in all those instances is to very carefully present the Rebbe's arguments and to present it in a way that really reflected what he thought and not in a way that tried to vindicate my position.
Right.
But that's why I wanted to note it up front.
Up front. So as far as you know, were there ever any meetings specifically with the Rebbe about his position on these things, or are these simply from his talks or from his writing, like about Soviet Jewry or about territorial compromise? Because I know he met with Israeli generals, Israeli prime ministers.
Yes. Okay, so I'll give you an example. He met most of the Israeli prime ministers, though most of them he did not meet during their years in office. Like he had quite a real impact on Prime Minister Netanyahu, but it was during the time Netanyahu was the ambassador to the UN. I believe the only prime minister he met during the years of his stewardship was Menachem Begin. Mm-hmm. And Begin came to the Rebbe on his first visit to America. He was accompanied by his close advisor, who's now become quite widely known, Yehuda Avner. Yehuda Avner, excuse me. And the Rebbe was very pleased with Begin. And Avner actually, a number of years ago, spoke at a keynote, the annual gathering of the Chabad Shluchim, about that meeting and had written about it in his book. Because at that time, Begin was opposed to all territorial compromise as well. Later on, of course, and the meeting ended on a very cordial note, and Avner said that Begin then dispatched him after the meetings with Carter to go back to the Rebbe and to report on everything that had happened. Subsequently, we know, of course, Sadat announced his famous outreach to the Jewish community and to Israel, and that he wanted peace and that he came there. And in the aftermath of that, there were the Camp David Accords, in which Begin agreed to return all of the Sinai. By the way, Begin also wanted to return Gaza, which would have been wonderful. Mm-hmm. The Egyptians didn't want to take it. Right. The Egyptians didn't want it. So Avner didn't refer to that in his speech at the Kinos, but I asked Avner, I assume you stayed in touch with the Rebbe after that first meeting. Did the Rebbe try to communicate to Begin his unhappiness with the Camp David Accords? And he said yes. I said, he expressed it very clearly to Avner. I said, so did you report to Begin? So he said, of course I reported to Begin. So I said, how did Begin react? He said, Begin was an interesting person. He said, Begin was a fierce debater. And when Begin wanted to oppose somebody, and we know he'd have debate, Shlomo Aloni with others, he wouldn't hold back. But there were people he was not going to get into a public fight with or a private fight. He had too much respect for the Rebbe, and he was not going to have a fight with the Rebbe. So what he did was he just ignored the issue. So I said to Avner, so what happened? He said, I told Begin exactly what the Rebbe had said to me. Begin looked and said, Azoi, and then never discussed it again.
Right. But if you had the opportunity to speak to the Rebbe, to interview the Rebbe, perhaps in writing the book, what might you have asked him?
Well, by the way, that whole Soviet Jewry issue, I would have asked him, to what extent did he think that a positive role was played by people who were pro-demonstration? Could it have all worked if all of Jewry was adopting a non-demonstration attitude? One of the questions I would have asked him is this, and I asked many shluchim and others this question, because I think there is an issue that was starting to become pressing during his lifetime, but I think has become more pressing since. And that is, I would want to know if he would have been willing, if he would think it now appropriate to relax any of the demands made of would-be converts to Judaism in instances where the father was Jewish. Now, we all know that according to halacha, obviously Judaism is determined by one's mother. So from the perspective of halacha, the commonly used sociological term, somebody who's half Jewish, actually has no halachic credence. Somebody is either Jewish or not Jewish. Nonetheless, we know that there are now an enormous number, hundreds of thousands, of American Jews who have a Jewish father, many of whom are interested in conversion to Judaism, many of whom are assumed by people to be Jewish because they have Jewish last names because of their father. Would the Rebbe feel that what we call the category of Zera Yisrael, coming from the seed of Israel, would sanction any more liberal approach, both in terms of the standards demanded of them and of encouraging conversion on their part. Because I think that's become a critical issue. We have an unhappy demographic. On a more personal level, if there are personal lessons I'd want to learn from the Rebbe, he maintained, and you and I were talking about this before, because you also expressed interest in this very issue, is he seemed to have maintained a fantastically and consistently calm demeanor. Now, for example, I know that on days on which I maybe slept 3 or 4 hours the night before, I am perhaps more apt to be snappy or in other ways manifest impatience.
Not snappy as in peppy. Right,
right, yes. Not snappy as in peppy, but snappy as in is obnoxious. Okay. I mean, for the Rebbe, 3 and 4 hours of sleep seemed to have been a norm. In general, he maintained an upbeat sense of optimism. Did he just have an innate emunah? I remember one of the famous early articles written about the Rebbe was, interestingly enough, written by a Reform rabbi, Herbert Wiener. Wiener, in 1957, I believe it was, published 2 articles in Commentary magazine, and he had spent a considerable amount of time at Chabad, and he said that the Rebbe, at one point, made a very important point to him. He said, faith is like the body, it has to be fed. So was that, though, the feeding of the faith through the mitzvot, was that enough to keep him? There was something unique about his ability to work as hard as he did. He never took vacations. I just like to understand how he saw his mission in life, his personal level of happiness. And obviously we know that he did not have children, which in some ways the movement might well have profited from, because the devotion to the movement was so absolute. But we all know that's a very painful thing for people to suffer. And yet the Rebbe maintained this upbeat sense and was able to inspire people with a sense of optimism. People left his office in much better moods and could often retain it. And is this something that every one of us can cultivate? Or I'd want to know, how do you cultivate it?
So that leads me to questions about teachings from the Rebbe that you address in the book that have an impact on everyday life. And you mentioned early in the book, you speak of the profound impact that doing this research for several years has had on your life. So maybe you can address that.
Yeah, in a variety of ways. The Rebbe didn't necessarily articulate it in the words that I used. I identified 7 virtues. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that animated me, a very significant factor that animated me to write the book, was to try and understand this fantastically successful Jewish leader, how he inspired people, and how he continued to inspire people even after he died. So he left behind a sort of Torah Sheba'al Peh, an oral law, an oral model of behavior. And so in analyzing and looking over dozens of stories that were told about him, I saw ways of categorizing them. One of them, he was very into the use of optimistic language. This is one of the very first ones I learned about. I remember my friend Simon Jacobson happened to mention to me in passing, that the Rebbe never liked the word in Hebrew for hospital. Here, I'm just going to ask people, call it out. I just want to see how many people know this Hebrew. What's the word for hospital in Hebrew? Beit Cholim. Many, many people know it. The Rebbe would never use that term. He didn't like it because if you know Hebrew, you know it literally means house of the sick. He thought it was demoralizing. And so he urged hospitals in Israel to adopt the name Beit Refuah, house of healing. When I heard that, it reminded me, my mother had told me, probably now 45 years ago, that when she was growing up in New York, they had hospitals called Home for the Incurables. There were Catholic homes for the incurables, Jewish homes for the incurables. And could you imagine you're in a hospital? Oh, we're transferring you tomorrow to the home for the incurables. So the Rebbe very much would oppose that. And there's a famous incident where he met with Israeli soldiers, Nechei Tzahal, the handicapped of Tzahal. He said everybody who has a handicap usually develops some compensatory mechanism. We know blind people usually have a more acute hearing, more understanding. So there are ways in which you are Mitsuyanei Tzahal. Why call you Nechei Tzahal, and I remembered I had once read a memoir of a soldier who had lost both arms during World War II. And he was in Army rehabilitation along with other people who had suffered grievous injuries. And the day before they were released, an Army doctor practicing a version of what they call tough love said, "Today you're going out as Army heroes. A year from now you'll be handicapped veterans, and after that you'll just be cripples." Right. So I thought, here's the lashon of the Rebbe, the language used by the Rebbe is this positive language. Oh, here's one that'll be a challenge to you because of the work you do.
Yes,
I no longer use the word deadline.
Right.
I no longer use the word deadline. The Rebbe thought it had negative connotations. So what did I come up with? Due date. So now I always speak of due date. Think of the difference. Deadline connotes death. Due date connotes birth. Since writing the book, one of my greatest moments of joy was a few days after speaking in El Paso, Texas. I found somebody emailed to me, forwarded to me, a text that went out from the head of the Federation there. We are no longer using the word deadline, asking everyone to use due date. The Rebbe also had a gift, I believe, for disagreeing without being disagreeable, which meant he had very strong principles. He didn't back down on them. But he found ways to focus on commonalities so that when a rabbi wrote him a letter articulating a sharp disagreement with the Rebbe on an issue, the Rebbe wrote back, but there are 612 areas in which we agree. And this is so characteristic of contemporary American Jewish religious life and contemporary American political life. Every 4 years during presidential campaigns, I'll ask audiences, can you think of a reason somebody's voting for the candidate whom you oppose that doesn't reflect badly either on their character or their intellect? And I rarely find liberals or conservatives who can think of a single reason somebody's voting for the other candidate that doesn't either come out of a sense of selfishness on the part of the person or a sense of stupidity. And so the Rebbe instead searched out for commonalities. And one of them that I put emphasis on is we all were raised with the expression, I'll start it, you fill in the last word. Anything worth doing is worth doing well. The Rebbe's attitude was anything worth doing is worth doing now. And I was very moved. One of my early readers in the book before publication was Ruth Messenger. And Ruth, of course, has occupied very important positions and now is the head of the American Jewish World Service. And she told me she had read the whole book, and she said it's already started to change my behavior. And she said, particularly in that issue, anything worth doing is worth doing now. We all have a tendency to defer things that we know we really should get to. And the Rebbe said if they're really worth getting to, get to it now. So these were things that have all personally impacted me.
So just a very brief chronological order of the Rebbe's career leading up to his becoming the Rebbe. I mean, he was recognized as an Eloi, as a genius in learning as a youngster. Although he never studied in a yeshiva, we spoke about that. He was privately tutored, I guess,
right,
when he was young.
Well, when he was very young, he actually, he studied at the local yeshiva where he was. But you're right, by the age of 11, it essentially ended. In that regard, of course, he's similar to Rav Soloveitchik.
Right. Who
did not attend a regular yeshiva.
Right. Just think how bright he would have been if he had gone to.
Right.
Okay. So.
Gone to YU.
So after his marriage to the.
Chaya Mushka, to the second daughter of the previous
right,
Rebbe.
But I'm saying not he wasn't the Frierdiker Rebbe when he was the Rebbe. It's a little confusing.
He was known as Ramash.
Right. So the Rebbe and his wife spent time in Europe. That's sort of a fascinating, a little bit opaque time for historians, I guess, in terms of they seem to be living a somewhat cosmopolitan life. He was attending university. They went out to theater, things like that. Did you learn, new parts of his life?
Yeah, one of the things I learned, there was a biography written a number of years ago of the Rebbe that made it more opaque than the actual sources would reveal it to be. Even during those years when he was in France, he was spending an average of 3 to 4 months a year at the court of Chabad, which in those years was in Poland. He wrote a commentary on the Tanya. He was involved a lot in learning. So one of these biographies gave what I think was a somewhat distorted view during that period. You know, the Rav commented upon the fact that even during his years in Germany, when Rav Soloveitchik knew him, he would go to the mikveh daily. So
he meaning the Rebbe.
Meaning the future Rebbe, as you
Future
put it,
Rebbe.
right? Yes. So he seemed to have been quite consistent in his observance, but nonetheless, you're right. You don't have. That's another interesting aspect that he had in common with Soloveitchik, with Rav Soloveitchik, was of course the fact that they both attended university. So here you have the irony of it. They didn't go to a standard yeshiva, but they did both go to university. I think it's one of the reasons they felt a certain affinity for each other. It's certainly the reason Menachem Mendel seeks out Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rav Menachem Mendel seeks out Rabbi Soloveitchik when he comes to Germany, because here's a model of somebody who came. Because we know that in the very frum world, there was a real resistance then, and as there is now, to university. And so he actually sought out to meet Soloveitchik when he came to Berlin.
So you mentioned about the attitude toward university, and you deal with it in the book in terms of some of the more controversial, perhaps, viewpoints of the Rebbe. And one was for Hasidim not to attend university. And although he did, and maybe because he did, he was worried about others doing it. But you also talk about how he seemed to have a certain strong point of view, but in practical terms or one-on-one, he might not have been so consistent. I mean, he would tell people who were already in university, for instance, sometimes to continue their studies. Was there a pattern?
Well, one thing that's important, rather than I say use the word consistent, I would use the term that Rabbi Krinsky, who was certainly, as close in age as one could be to the Rebbe, he said to me the Rebbe was not a cookie cutter type. He didn't have one answer for everyone. And in fact, he wasn't always pleased when people passed on the advice he had given them to others, because as he said on a number of occasions, what I say to one person is not necessarily what I say to another. So you had, for example, a young man who was studying at Harvard for his PhD in philosophy, Irving, now he's known as Yitzchak Bloch, who started studying at the yeshiva in Crown Heights, and came to the Rebbe, and he wanted to remain at the yeshiva, and the Rebbe pushed him to go back to Harvard. And on at least two other occasions, he told the Rebbe he really wanted to study at the yeshiva, and the Rebbe said he could study during the summer, and he pushed him to finish his PhD in Harvard because he thought it was important. It was clear he thought it was important that there be frum Jews who could be academics. Another man who has the unusual name, who died only 2 years ago, I believe, Jacob Hanukkah, who was a Sephardic Jew, also wanted to drop out of his PhD program and come learn in the yeshiva. And the Rebbe said to him, you can do more good for the Jewish people with 3 letters after your name than with the title rabbi before. And Hanukkah acknowledged, ultimately, and Bloch, the Rebbe actually, after Bloch got his PhD, he came. He wanted to learn at the yeshiva. And everybody who wanted to get smicha had to send in a request to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe wrote back to him, basically, as for your request for getting smicha, low with a capital, it's like low with a capital Aleph. I mean, basically, it was emphasizing, because he thought that Bloch could do more, and Bloch said he realized that he could, because he looks like any Chabad shliach. He has a long beard. And he said it was remarkably impressive to students that he had gotten his PhD at Harvard, and they were more open to hearing from him. So I entitled the chapter on college. I said why people shouldn't go to college and why those who start shouldn't drop out. Right. So he had a mix of attitudes. One thing in his own life, if you remember, he didn't start university till his mid-20s. He was more open to people doing it in their mid-20s when they had developed more of a shita, more of an approach. He felt people were very impressionable when they were 18 or 19, that universities are usually populated in large measure, particularly in the social sciences, by people of a much more secular and often anti-religious orientation, and he thought it could have a negative impact on many people.
So you also talk, it seemed kind of ironic to me, where he, some people would come to him and he'd say, he would want to empower them. You know, you have the answer. I don't know how often he did that, but the idea of coming to a Rebbe in the first place and seeking advice seems to be part of a central part of the Hasidic tradition. So is there a little irony there?
It is part, and yet the Rebbe would often turn people away when he didn't think they needed it. So one of the very earliest interviews I did was with Rabbi Groner, along with Rabbi Krinsky, one of the Rebbe's very close aides, and he told me of an incident when, as a young man, he was already working in the Rebbe's office. He came to the Rebbe with a shaila, with an actual question, and the Rebbe said to him, he says, "You have smicha like I have smicha, you go and rule." And Groner went back and came to a decision, told the Rebbe, and the Rebbe smiled and approved of it. So the Rebbe was concerned that people not too quickly discharge things. He wanted ultimately to empower people. Jonathan Sachs, 21, comes to meet with the Rebbe, and Sachs has gone on to note that he credits the Rebbe with the one who influenced him to enter the rabbinate, and mentions in passing, "I found myself in a situation." And the Rebbe said, don't use that language. Say you placed yourself in a situation. Because if you placed yourself in one situation, you can place yourself in another situation. But if you always think in terms of, I found myself in a situation, you're going to see yourself as more passive. In fact, there's a very moving story that came out very shortly before, when I was very near handing in my manuscript, and I also checked on it to make sure it was accurate, and it really is, with Tzvi Hirsch Weinrib. Weinrib, of course, was the longtime head of the OU, and he's now the editor-in-chief of the English language version of the Steinsaltz Talmud. And he recounts an episode how, as a young man, he was about 30, he was already married with children, he was living in Silver Springs in Maryland, and he went through, he said, an early midlife crisis. He had gotten his PhD in Maryland in child psychology, but trying to decide between being a clinical psychologist, working in the public school system, being a mechanech, working in Jewish education. He would give evening. He didn't know what to do. So he calls up, at the suggestion of a Chabadnik, he calls up the Rebbe's office. And in those days, remember, there was no caller ID. So Rabbi Chodakov, the Rebbe's very top aide, answers. He realized later it was Chodakov who answered the phone. And they're speaking, and he hears Chodakov repeating things that he's saying, and it becomes apparent that the Rebbe is in the room and hearing what he's saying, and he's expressing some of his concerns, and at a certain point, the Rebbe says, who are you speaking to? And when Chodakov asks Weinrib was reluctant to reveal his identity. He thought maybe he would end up not meeting with the Rebbe, so he just said a Jew from Maryland. And the conversation resumes, and he's raising more and more significant issues of doubt, issues of other things. And finally, the Rebbe says, tell him that there's a Jew in Maryland he should meet with. His name is Weinrib. So Weinrib is shocked. He said, I'm Weinrib. So Chodakov is shocked. Chodakov tells the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, Azoy, if that's the case, tell him to consult with himself. Rabbi Weinrib claims that was a pivotal event in his life. That since then, he said, I had always been of that more nervous disposition. Whenever a problem would come up, I'd call here, I'd call there, I'd seek advice. He said, the first person you should turn to is yourself. The reason I think this is crucial in the chapter where I write about it on the creation of leadership is because it helps explain a phenomenon that isn't widely understood about Chabad. People do think to be that the Rebbe really just wanted a lot of followers, but if you look at the behavior of the shluchim in any community, they do tend to be activists and leaders, and it's because he really did empower them.
So I want to get to two key issues, and then I hope you're jotting down your questions. We'll get to those in a few minutes. So one is about his succession to become the Rebbe. In the biography you mentioned before, there was part of it is that the Rebbe had two daughters and two sons-in-law.
Right.
The previous Rebbe. And there seemed to be no particular succession plan. And I don't know if that's consistent within Hasidic movement, but and apparently the Rebbe didn't leave specific instructions about who would follow him. And is the plan that the next Rebbe simply sort of emerges? The more critical biography talks about Rabbi Schneerson coming to America as an immigrant, has a degree in engineering, works in the Navy Yards,
Right.
And when his father-in-law dies, it's almost, I'm exaggerating, but, this would be an interesting way to make a living.
Right.
So.
Okay, I don't want to make it sound like I'm avoiding mentioning the book, like
Yeah.
it's some unholy book. So
Yeah.
the book is, of course, The Rebbe by Sam Heilman and Menachem Friedman.
Right.
And it's a book I have some real disagreements with it. They have a point of view, but I don't think it fully accurately reflects the facts, which is what they argue essentially in the book is that the Rebbe came to covet the position, and while publicly appearing to not want it and acting as if he didn't want it, they were privately he was scheming with people behind the scenes to get it.
And this is during the year after the Rebbe
Right.
died until he.
Yeah. While the Frierdiker Rebbe, while the previous Rebbe was alive, there was no public speculation going around about who would be his successor, despite the fact that he was in very poor health for a long time. And the reason being that certainly in traditional Jewish life, you never speculate about a successor in the lifetime. You never publicly speculate about a successor during the lifetime of the leader. So the previous Rebbe dies, and he had 3 daughters. The youngest daughter, Shana, and her husband had been murdered in Treblinka. 2 daughters had gotten out with their husbands to the United States. And there was no question that the oldest daughter, Hannah, very much coveted the position for her husband, Shmaryahu. There's also no question the Rebbe really was not desirous of the position. He was very much a private person. He was known for being friendly and warm during Yechidison with people. I think it was an acquired trait. He had a love of people, but he was of a more shy nature. And I think he had to cultivate that. And his wife, I think, had a more retiring nature in a sense than he did. And he liked being a scholar, and he really was quite a prodigious scholar. But the Hasidim recognized in him talents in that way. I'll just give you one example. It was an interesting incident. One of the people I interviewed at length for the book is Zalman Schachter, who I mentioned earlier. Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who is now primarily known as the founder of the Renewal Movement, for a good part of his life was very much involved in the world of Chabad, and quite intimately involved. And he knew Menachem Mendel Schneerson even, who was older than him, obviously, even going back to France. So Zalman told me he was a rabbi, I think in Falls River, Massachusetts, and the Frierdiker Rebbe had died on a Shabbos morning, so people couldn't find out till after Shabbos. He got a phone call after Shabbos. He drove in, and he remembers in the morning they were doing the tahara, the purification. I'm translating because not everybody knows every Hebrew term. They were doing the purification of the body, and he was standing outside the room where it was taking place. Immediately outside the room were Menachem Mendel Schneerson and Shmaryahu Gerari, the 2 sons-in-law. And he said a couple of times it happened, the door would open from the tahara room, and they would come out with a shaila, with a question having to do with Jewish law. And he noticed the questions were always being directed to Menachem Mendel. And he said it was just clear right away that he was going to be the Rebbe. He then told me another interesting story. About a month later, and by the way, there are sources other than Zalman Schachter of other people who were close in who verify this. But he told me about a month later he came in and went to the grave of the Rebbe who had just died. And then when he came back to 770, he washed his hands. It's clear he was coming from a cemetery. And Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was then known as the Ramash, saw him and gave him a bracha. Whatever you prayed for should come to pass. So Zalman said, if they only let it. So this was a puzzling response. So Ramash said to him, what did you pray for? He said, I prayed for 3 things: that we should have a Rebbe, that you should be the Rebbe, and that you should have children. This is one of only 3 instances I came across in which anybody had ever directly said anything to the Rebbe about his childlessness. And so he said the Rebbe's eyes welled up with tears, and the Rebbe, but it was not clear whether it was because of that or because of his father-in-law's death was very recent. He grabbed Zalman's hand, and he said, Zalman, why do we need a Rebbe? We already have a Rebbe. Why does it matter whether he is here, meaning in 770, or he's there at the cemetery? We still have a Rebbe. So Zalman gave an inspired answer. Zalman said to him, why does it say at the end of the Torah that we don't know where Moshe was buried? He says, so Yehoshua couldn't say to people, go pray there. And I asked him once, that was a really quick response. He said, it just came into my head. He said, I don't know where it came from. But he resisted for a very long time. And one of the ways in which his resistance was manifest is that for, I think, 7 or 8 months after the death of his father-in-law, he continued to wear, as he always did, Western clothes. There's no way somebody dressed, well, I'm wearing a suit, you're wearing a jacket and pants, but there's no way somebody dressed like ours is going to be taken seriously as a Rebbe. So it took a long time till he started dressing in the clothing of a, he would always wear the Hasidic clothing on Shabbat and on the Chagim, but he started then wearing it on a daily basis.
But was there an election, or it's simply or his Rebbe-ness emerges? I mean, how does
his Rebbe-ness emerges? He gets appeals. Letters start being written from the Hasidim in England is one of the first, and then from the Hasidim in Israel, Rav Zevin, who's one of the leading figures. They start to come in, and in Australia. And one of the reasons was Rabbi Garari, who was a distinguished fellow. Rabbi Garari was the head of the Chabad Yeshiva, and people who might have preferred Menachem Mendel, were afraid to alienate him as well. So it was actually harder in Brooklyn for people to take a public stance, but it soon started to become clear that there was of the people who were willing to come out publicly, overwhelmingly it was in behalf of Menachem Mendel Schneerson.
Right. I think I mentioned to you the other day that I once interviewed Rabbi Garari.
Right.
Early 70s. So I can't not ask you about the Mashiach issue and controversy. It seems clear that the idea of bringing the Mashiach and having it happen, imminently, was something that the Rebbe was very central to his beliefs, if not an obsession. And he speaks of it in his very first major talk, right, in 1951 when he becomes the Rebbe, and in later years it intensifies. And in Rabbi Steinsaltz's book, called My Rebbe, that also just came out recently. He says the Rebbe considered it possible that he might be tapped as the Mashiach. And in various websites, if you go on the websites, and I'm sure you've seen all these references by the Rebbe himself about his father-in-law being the prince of his generation, talks about the prince of his generation, and sometimes says that he lives within me. So you mentioned that it's sort of not really an issue in the book, and maybe you can explain how you came to that.
Well, it's an interesting thing. I just thought about your earlier question. If I could meet the Rebbe and not ask him personal questions of guidance in my life, but ask him the questions that a biographer would want to ask. I suppose one of them I would ask is, do you feel that you led a successful life? Because I think almost anybody else would look at the Rebbe's life and think it was successful. But look at the standard he had set for himself. He had set in the opening speech, his inaugural speech as Rebbe, that we are going to live in the generation in which the Mashiach would come, and the Mashiach hadn't. So, but the question is, did the Rebbe think he himself was the Mashiach? And the answer is, I came to a very firm conclusion that he did not think that. And a few things supported that conclusion. One of them was something that Yosef Greenberg told me. Rabbi Yosef Greenberg is the Chabad Shliach in Anchorage, Alaska. He was actually the last Shliach personally sent out by the Rebbe, who told him to go warm up Alaska. But Greenberg was actually quite a scholar, and he's the one who wrote the book Yemei Breshit, which is a large Hebrew language book on the year between the death of the previous Rebbe and Menachem Mendel's becoming Rebbe. And he, at that time, in 91, 92, really was a Messianist. And he wrote a letter to the Rebbe and addressed it to him as Melech HaMashiach, the King Messiah. Gave it to Rabbi Groner to bring in, because the letter then contained a question to the Rebbe. And when Groner came out, he said, what did the Rebbe answer? He said, he threw your letter down on the table and made a note on it. Tell him that when the Mashiach comes, I'll give him the letter. And, and this was characteristic of several episodes that I cite in the book. How did the whole thing come about that there are people who believe is the Mashiach, particularly given that the Rebbe was an ardent believer in the writings of Maimonides, of Rambam. And if you look at the last 2 chapters of the Yad Chazaka, the Rambam's halachic code, he makes it very clear what the Mashiach has to do. The Mashiach has to restore all the Jews to Israel, restore all the Jews to full religious observance, bring universal peace, and the Rebbe hadn't done it. What I came to understand is that when the word Mashiach is used among some Chabadniks, it has a slightly different meaning. And we find this also noted in the Chasam Sofer. If the Mashiach has to achieve all of those things, according to Maimonides, how could Rabbi Akiva have so erred and thought that Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach? No, he motivates the Jews to follow Bar Kokhba, and it leads to a horrible catastrophe. And the idea developed that in every generation there is always one person who's Ra'ui Liyot Mashiach. There's one person worthy of being the Mashiach. And if God so wills it, then the Mashiach will be revealed in that generation. So even those who believed in the messiahship of the Rebbe, I think they meant that he was worthy of being Mashiach because he certainly didn't fulfill the Messianic mission. Now, there are a couple of sources in the Talmud, they're pretty obscure and they're not widely utilized, that claims that the Mashiach could come back from the dead. So I think they're still hoping that he could come back. Why do I say I don't think it's as big an issue now? You know and I know from having studied Talmud that there's the Shaila raised in Talmud, L'may nafka mina. What's the practical implication? If you hold this position or that, what's the upshot of it? If the Mashiach really has come, there is an upshot. A lot of Jewish laws get suspended. There's a pasuk in Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, that says that fast days will be suspended when the Mashiach comes. I don't know of any Chabad Mashiachistim who've suspended fast days. So that's what I'm saying. I think it was assigned a greater significance than it should have been, even though we all remember, all those chants of we want Mashiach now. But you're right, and I think this was probably the most profound disappointment in the Rebbe's life that the Mashiach didn't come. But I don't think it ever became that issue that he thought he was the Mashiach.
So I'm looking through some of your questions that came up here, and I want to compliment you on your penmanship. So I'm going to deal with a couple that are similar, and one is, beyond the Chabad organization movement, what is the Rebbe's legacy or impact? And another similar, what can we take away from his leadership beyond his impact on the Chabad world? Okay, beyond the impact, I would say that when I started working on the book, certainly when I was younger, I saw the Rebbe primarily as a leader of Chabad. Then I saw he was starting to have an impact on the whole Jewish people. Then I saw he had a surprising amount of impact even on the world. So this is important. First of all, in addressing the issue of the broader Jewish people. It was very striking in 2003 at the convention of the URJ, the Union of Reform Judaism. Rabbi Eric Yaffe, who's a distinguished major Reform rabbi, got up and announced, and he says, "It is hard for me to say it, but I must say it nonetheless. We must learn from the example of Chabad." Rick Jacobs, his successor, made a comparable sort of comment. So I think there was an increasingly a realization that one of the Rebbe's emphases, the mitzvah campaigns, are needed by the whole Jewish community. Judaism can't just be something abstract. Judaism cannot just be issues, let's say, for liberals of social justice. There has to be some mode of continuity and some sense of personal connection to God. And that was the power
of the Tefillin campaign. It was the power of the candle lighting campaign. It was the power of the Hanukkah campaign. And all of these things, I think, have really started to have a broader impact in the Jewish community. So increasingly, I think he was thought of as somebody who had a religious message to the world, the tremendous emphasis on education. Remember, Jimmy Carter established National Education Day, which to this year is renewed annually, and it's tied into the Rebbe's birthday. So there was a sense that he had a broader message, and so that's why he was a big teacher. Now, and also for personal, that's why the 7 virtues that I articulate in the book can change anybody here of any religion. They have valuable things to offer, offering unconditional love and always staying focused on the individual. That's, we know from within my own family, the attention the Rebbe's office showed to my father when he had a stroke. So he stayed focused on the individual. That point I made earlier, anything worth doing is worth doing now. How to disagree without becoming disagreeable. These are all traits that really can help anybody in their daily behavior.
Well, what was the Rebbe's involvement with Israeli politics? And I think any of us, when we go to Israel, we see the pictures of the Rebbe, posters of the Rebbe all over still, more than we see anywhere else, I guess. You mentioned that he had met with generals and former prime ministers. In terms of his actual political influence?
Well, his political influence we know because on one occasion he basically prevented Shimon Peres from becoming prime minister at one point. And
you want to explain that a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah.
He didn't actively do it. The Rebbe was very opposed to any territorial compromise. He knew that Peres favored it. And as I said, that was an area in which I have a differing point of view. But Peres was about to form a government, a very narrow government. He was only going to have 61 votes. And he had managed to secure the support of Agudas Yisrael, which had at that time 5 Knesset seats. But two of those 5 people felt a devotion to the Rebbe. They weren't, in one instance, certainly he was not a direct Chabadnik, but they therefore didn't want to join that government. They knew they couldn't vote against the government because they were bound by party discipline. So on the day of the vote, they simply didn't show up at the Knesset and couldn't be found. So from that point on, there's a funny story actually that Rabbi Lau tells, that he went to see the Rebbe a short time later, and the Rebbe told him, he says, take care of all your affairs. Lau at the time was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. Take care of all your affairs, for shortly you're going to become the chief rabbi of Israel. And Lau was taken aback. And when he went out, and people heard about it because there were people standing in back of Lau, so word spread around. And when he was going out, the Israeli consul general at the time was there, whose name I'm now forgetting. He went on to be one of the architects of the Oslo Accords.
Yossi Beilin?
It wasn't Beilin.
No, it wasn't Beilin.
Okay, I won't spend the time now. But so he congratulated Lau. He says, "Congratulations, Rav Harash, Chief Rabbi." And Lau said, "What should I make of all of this?" He said, "If the man sitting there could determine who the Prime Minister of Israel can be, he certainly can tell us who's going to be the Chief Rabbi." But the Rebbe, always emphasized he had never told them how to vote, or he had never done anything like that. But the bottom line is he had this real love for Israel. One of the arguments I make in the book is Chabad historically had been anti-Zionist, which was quite typical of the Hasidic and of the whole Haredi world. And the Rebbe is the one who moved it to non-Zionist. He couldn't, why do I not say he's a Zionist? Because the thought of a secular Jewish state is not something that he could ever have been comfortable with. But his support, for Israel and for the Jews, and his love for the soldiers, and he said they are, prior to the Six-Day War, he made that famous statement to the effect that what they're doing is the holiest work that needs to be done at this time, even more so than in the yeshivas. What they're doing, which in that world was quite a striking observation. And that's why he has this incredibly moving encounter with the Nechei Tzahal, the handicapped, who he calls the Mitzianei, the excellent ones of Tzahal. And there were no shortage of Israeli generals. And I tell the story in the book, who when they were thinking of leaving the army, the Rebbe would say, you can't leave. This is not the right time for you to leave. And they would be inspired. And these were by no means people who were traditionally observant Jews, because he didn't withhold that love. And it wasn't an act. You see, that's what people didn't understand. The love was really there. It was not a strategy. What I used to hear sometimes people say, oh yeah, Chabad has this smart strategy. They act like they love everybody to open up their purses. That's not the case. When Lau, as a young man, comes to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, what are you involved in doing? And he says, I'm involved in Kiruv Rechokim. I'm involved in bringing near those who are far away. The Rebbe says to him, how do we know who's Karov? How do we know who's Rachok? How do we know who's near? How do we know who's far? They're all near in God. They're all dear and near in God's eyes. This was not. When George Rohr comes to him, and George is, of course, this well-known philanthropist, but he's also a knowledgeable Jew. He starts the beginner's minyan at Haskell Lookstein's at KJ, and he comes and says to the Rebbe with pride after Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, he says, I want the Rebbe to know I conducted a service for 180 Jews with no background. And the Rebbe's sort of looking at him a little stone-faced, and he thinks, the Rebbe was an old man at the time, so he thinks he probably didn't hear him. So he says it in a louder voice. I want the Rebbe should know I conducted a service for 180 Jews with no background. And the Rebbe says, what do you mean they have no background? They're the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. This is what it is, this sort of acceptance. And then, of course, he had that love, therefore, for Israel and for the people who were guarding it.
I think everybody here would join me in thanking you, Joseph, for a really fascinating erudition on the Rebbe and his life. And I just want to again thank our friends here at Lincoln Square Synagogue and our team at the Jewish Week, and mostly thank all of you and thank Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, and wish you all a good evening. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV on JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.